Okay. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're ready to begin panel 2 for day 3 of Land Force Pacific 2017. Our last panel for the event is Empowering the Team, Innovation and Experimentation in Partnership with Industry and Partner Nations. And chairing our panel this morning is Dr. William Roper, the Director of the Strategic Capabilities Office at the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And our moderator for this panel is Dr. Matthew Goda, Division Chief, Resources and Assessment Directorate at United States Pacific Command. Please welcome our panel for this morning. Thank you all very much.
Aloha and good morning. What I'm going to do is maybe set the stage a little bit, introduce the panelists, and then we'll go down through and have time for each of them, and we're going to try to leave a lot of time for questions at the end. But I'd like to maybe put this in the sense of how can we, from the innovation and experimentation perspective, provide what I'll call maneuver, maybe to put it into Army speak, within the acquisition system. How can we provide both material and non-material capabilities quicker and in essence outmaneuver those who are our adversaries. So first to my right is Dr. Will Roper, who is the founding director of the Pentagon's Strategic Capabilities Office, or SCO. It was established in 2012 to come up with new, unexpected, game-changing initiatives to address our greatest problems. For a long time it was hidden away, but has now become a little bit more fame. And most recently, if you look up 60 Minutes, you'll see Dr. Roper leading a group doing the world's largest swarm of 103, I believe, systems at one time. To his right is Dr. Kailivai, or Dr. K, as we call him up at the headquarters. He is the Director for Resources and Assessments and leads the Pacific Command not only in strategic assessments, but really in the whole breadth of capability acquisition and development, all the way from influencing the service POMs to innovation experimentation, and also S&T as within his portfolio. He has over 30 years of test and evaluation experience within the Air Force, DoD, and particularly Air Force. To his right is Dr. Lam, goes by Kaipo, and he is a academically trained futurist. And here local, he is the chief executive of the Vision Foresight Strategy firm, which is a strategic analysis firm based here in Honolulu, and also the author of 4 Steps to the Future, a quick and clean guide to creating foresight, published in numerous different areas, and also has supported numerous different companies, both within industry and then across the DoD. To his right is Major General Cedric Wins, who is a commanding general of the U.S. Army Research Development and Engineering Command, or RDECOM. His charter is to provide the innovative research, development, and engineering to provide that decisive overmatch for our Army against current and future operating environments that we will face as a nation. And then to his right is Mr. Doug Wiltsey, who is the director of the Army's Rapid Capability Office, which was officially created just in August to zero in on the Army's biggest requirements with the intent to deliver capabilities within a 1-year time frame. And finally, last is Mr. Isaac Taylor, who is currently a partner at the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental, or DIUX, within the Department of Defense. He is the operations and general manager with a lot of experience launching and scaling startups and building high-performance cross-functional teams, and has spent many years at Google and has his fingerprints over many things, including Google Maps, which maybe a lot of us use to even navigate around our island, and multiple other projects at Google, including the self-driving car and Google Glass. So we have a really good panel. I think we'll get a great breadth of exposure to different ways of approaching this problem. and look forward to posing your questions to the panelists as time goes on. Dr. Roper.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate you moderating, and thanks to AUSA for doing this event. It's critically important to think about the future of land power now, as we're thinking about leaving the kinds of systems that we developed for the Cold War and starting to think about what does warfighting mean in the 21st century. And to that end, I have one of the best jobs in the Pentagon because I have a very high-level task that has never been subdivided by the Secretary, and that's simply to get us ready to win tomorrow's war. And that is no easy task, but I can tell you it's easier than you think. And I definitely want to highlight some of the terrific work that has happened here with the Army components and PACOM, thinking about how to make land power in the Pacific something that isn't just a contributor, but something that could be a dominating force in a future conflict. So if you've never heard of Strategic Capabilities Office, for a long time it was not something that was widely discussed publicly. But over the last year and a half, we have tried to learn how to have a public face, which for me, having worked on classified systems most of my career, has been a change. But the benefit about having a public face is you can get more people involved in the work that you're doing. And if we're going to get ourselves ready for future conflict, we will not do it alone. We will need every part of the Pentagon, we will need our allies and partners, we will need industry, all focused in the same direction. And that direction needs to be regaining the element of surprise. That's our basic hypothesis, folks, is that the issues that we've gotten ourselves into are not really surprising. We've been projecting power more or less the same way for 2.5 decades. And so it's really no surprise that in today's day and time that we face challenges to this very old playbook of power projection. And if you were to think of our military as a football team or any sports team that plays with a team dynamic, then analysts would tell us that we've run our playbook for too long. The adversaries have had time to watch the game film, go figure out what they need to develop to exploit perceived vulnerabilities, and now they're coming to the playing field with that second mover advantage. So if we are like a sports team, what would a football team do in our position? I tell you what they wouldn't do is throw away a successful playbook. They wouldn't say all the plays that we've run in the past are now of no value. What they try to do is regain the element of surprise. They start running when it looked like they would pass, passing when it looks like they would run, and that uncertainty as to what's coming next is what allows a team to regain its old playbook with some new trick plays mixed in. And so most of the things we do in SCO are trying to find the analog of a trick play. How do we take something that is currently predictable and remove that predictability from it? So when I first came to the Pacific 5 years ago, there wasn't really a big story for the Army here, because you could argue there's a lot of water here and not a lot of land. But it's interesting to see now, 5 years later, that these analogs of trick plays aren't just things that are few and far between. They're quite numerous. One of the few that we can talk about was announced by Secretary Carter a few months ago, which is that we've been working with USARPAC for years and with the Army as a whole to try to let the Army go cross-domain, to put a seeker on the ATACMS missile so it not only does strike against land targets better, but it can go and project power into the sea, making navies of the world have to fear the Army and not be able to discount capabilities that come from land. That's a powerful concept. In fact, it's so powerful, many of our programs center around this idea of crossing or blurring domains. We want no parts of warfighting to be separable. Armies shouldn't just fight armies, they should fight navies, air forces, Marines, the whole gamut. The more we can blur those lines, the less predictable we'll be, the harder it will be to plan against us, and the more options for victory that we'll have. So I encourage all of you, as you're looking at what the future Army should be like, If you're thinking inside a single domain, don't. Break outside of it, because that's a direction we're going to have to go to have enough options available. Another thing that we find very powerful in trying to find these surprises, a way to make systems less predictable than they are currently, is by teaming systems. And I find this is something that our acquisition process doesn't do well naturally. When a system doesn't work anymore, we do an assessment and go build a better system. We just build a better copy of whatever we had in the past. And there's a lot of power in teaming systems together. And so it's more complicated design, but it's something we're going to have to get good at doing in order to have advantages and avoid having to build gold-plated systems every time we face a challenge. So example of our doing this, it's not an Army system, but I'm going to use an Air Force example because I want to make a separate point. So we're working on a project now that we call Avatar, where manned aircraft can have unmanned systems in front of them, taking on the dangerous roles. And they're not joysticked the way you would a racing drone. They're just simply quarterbacked. We're putting lots of autonomy into the drone, so it can just be given simple commands. So that may sound like a futuristic concept, but it's not. It's a concept as old as World War II. The U.S. built what you could call an Avatar, an unmanned heavy bomber that had a television camera on the front and was remotely piloted by a bomber flying behind it. So this is a 70-year-old concept. But what's different now is that now we can make that forward system autonomous. We can make it learn. We can make it adapt faster so that people don't have to do everything for this autonomous system in front. And that's my final point, is that we are going to have to adapt at the pace of commercial technology. That is the final way that we can get surprise back in our arsenal. The machine learning revolution, the data-driven revolution that's affecting all of us, all of you, we know we all have these, right? And they change all the time. We are going to have to prove to ourselves that we can adapt at that pace. And if we don't, we could be facing armies or navies or air forces in the future that have. And we do not want to face an enemy or an adversary whose systems learn, but ours do not. So we've been working on things like drones and trying to spiral them at the pace at which our iPhones and Samsung phones are updating. And we've been able to demonstrate it. But we're a small, agile, skunkworks type of office and are able to do that. We're going to need the broad acquisition enterprise to do it. So I encourage you to put pressure on us to not sit back and let industry move past us. So conclude, I've got a lot of hope now. After 5 years, we have had some amazing progress with the Army. So thank you if you've been one of the ones that's helped us. We've got a lot of ideas for the future, so we are by no means done yet. And I'm very, very optimistic about what the future holds for LANPAC. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today to speak about United States Pacific Command and how we use joint innovation and experimentation to address our challenges. If you could go ahead and put up the slide if you have it available, and you can go ahead and build a complete slide. So this should be of no surprise to everyone here in the room that ends, ways, and means is a wonderful construct to develop a strategy. The ends are the desired end states. The ways are the methods that we use to achieve those end states, and finally the means are the resources that we apply to achieve those end states. And typically when you see a briefing that addresses ends, ways, and means, the first thing that a speaker would do is start at the top and work their way down to the bottom. And I'm going to break that mold. And the reason why is because I really believe the difference occurs within the ways. And I'll say a few words about what's contained within the ways. And probably the first thing that you'll see at the very top there is warfighter requirements. And one can make the argument that actually the warfighter requirements are the ends. And I would submit to you that actually the warfighter requirements are not the ends per se, but rather a part of the means to get to the delivery of those war-winning capabilities that we need to have into the field. But I would even start from there. I'll readdress that here in a little bit. But what I want to do is call your attention to this book that's called Borrowing Brilliance by David Cord Murray. And I've been in this position now for a little under 10 years. And when I first showed up here in 2007, I learned that I had a joint innovation and experimentation division. It was comprised of about 3 people, if you can imagine a division of 3 people. And when I spoke with the then division chief, and that would be Dr. Goda's predecessor, we had a discussion about what does it mean to be innovative? What is innovation? How do you define what innovation is? And we modeled, frankly, for about 2 years trying to define that. Then we stumbled across this book called Borrowing Brilliance, and it was actually the division chief at the time, Mel Chalupka, and he said, you know, George, I just picked up this book and I started reading it, and I think there's something in it. And I'm not trying to sell this book, by the way. I get no kickback from the author. I don't even know who the author is, other than the fact that I've done a little bit of research on him. And we felt that there's something there. In fact, if I were to tell you that over the last 8 years now, the principles contained within this book are the ones that we now apply at United States Pacific Command. And the reason why is because when we look at innovation, we're really thinking about ideas. And those ideas are new and they're useful. That's what makes innovation. So in answering the question, well, what does it mean to be useful? Well, that gets down to defining the problem and understanding the capability gap that you have. And very fortunately, within the J8, we're also responsible for developing the requirements. That's called the Integrated Priority List. So we're all over the warfighter requirements. Those requirements state our capability gaps between the FIDIP. So in this case, it'll be between FY19 and FY23. On the other hand, the Joint Emergent Operational Need Statements, or what we call the GEONs, actually address something that we have to have between now and the next 2 to 3 years, thereabouts. And we also write the GEONs for the command. So we have a very, very good understanding of what the requirements are. And it starts off with defining what the problem set is. But that's not all, because when David Cord Murray explored, well, what is it with all of these ideas, and the title suggests it, obviously, answering the second one, what makes an idea new is something different. So I'll just read a little bit of an excerpt. To figure it out, I began to study ideas. I looked at my own ideas, the ideas of my colleagues, and the ideas of others in business, science, and the arts. I read biographies of Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, and the Google guys. I looked for the source and form of their new ideas. Then I studied Charles Darwin, Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein, Thomas Edison, and George Lucas. Again, I looked at their ideas. I wasn't trying to determine their thinking processes. I was just trying to determine the structure of their ideas. What made them new and different? It took a while, and I had to wade through a lot of crap. But when the fog cleared, I realized that each new idea was constructed out of existing ideas. And he quotes Albert Einstein, "The secret to creativity is knowing how to hide your sources." So the 6 steps that he talked about is something that we apply at United States Pacific Command. The first one I already discussed, which is defining the problem. The second one, or step 2, is borrowing. Borrow ideas from places with a similar problem. Third, combine. Collect and combine these borrowed ideas. 4, incubate, and one would call that experimentation, because that's what we do at United States Pacific Command within the J8. Allow the combinations to incubate into a solution. 5, judge. Identify the strength and weakness of the solution. We do that through our military utility assessments. And step 6 is enhancing. Eliminate the weak points while enhancing the strong ones. The reason why I wanted to spend so much time on borrowing brilliance is because I use that term quite a bit. I always talk about borrowing someone else's brilliance, because if someone were to tell me that there's nothing new under the sun, I would take exception to that. I think there are a lot of things that are new under the sun. However, if someone said to me, there's nothing brand new under the sun, I would agree. So the things that we've done based upon this philosophy is to bend the existing technology. That was a term that was coined by Admiral Harris's predecessor, by Admiral Locklear. And that whenever we incubate ideas, I have to give our folks, it's actually Matt Godis folks, the opportunity to fail. They have to have the permission to fail. Because as Americans, we're very much geared towards being success-oriented, that's hard to grasp, the fact that you can actually fail. We inject several experiments into our exercises. For Talisman Sabre, we injected 25 experiments, 27 experiments during Northern Edge, and 26 experiments during Valiant Shield. And we're also looking for a 80% solution as opposed to a 100% solution. So the ends that we're trying to achieve are those capabilities that we've heard talk about with multi-domain battle. We have a program called J-Strike, Joint Sensor to Tactically Responsive Integrated Kinetic Effects, which is a quick reaction test, which actually goes for non-material solutions. And we also have other projects that we're doing with the Japanese in both Mystic as well as Gambit. I'll finish by saying a few words about the resources. And a lot of folks will think first about money, which is true, it's good to have money. I think people are more important than money, but I'll also say that the most important commodity that we have as a combatant command is time, and we don't have much of that. So I want to thank you for all the work that all of you are doing out there in helping us achieve our objectives, and God bless. Thanks.
Aloha, everyone. Thank you very much for having me today. It's a pleasure to be on a panel with such distinguished leaders as are up here. And so, who would have ever thought that we, especially us, would be living in an age where our United States Air Force, with its very cool F-22s and F-35s, could possibly lose air superiority to a terrorist group with cobbled together homemade close air support, right? And that's the kind of world that we are living in today and moving into. I am, as Dr. Goda mentioned, a trained futurist, and my company does foresight and strategic analysis. And it was drilled into us in graduate school that we don't predict the future. Our job is supposed to be to help people better understand and anticipate change. And one of the many ways that we do that is through something we call, the methodology called emerging issues analysis. Now, out of all the building blocks of good foresight, all of us are familiar with trends. A trend is a description of historical change over time. It describes history. One of the things that we do, in addition to trends, one of the other building blocks that we try to build are called emerging issues, and these are emerging technologies, their future potential public policy problems, their new concepts or ideas that are all fringe or experimental now, but if they survive, if they mature, could become critically important for shaping things in the future. And so we generate these emerging issues. And so what I wanted to do was introduce a few of the types of emerging issues that we've been coming across in some of our work. And some of these come from some work that we did a little while back on what is an alternative to Chapter 1 of the Quadrennial Defense Review, which we briefed the White House on. And incidentally, I'll be at SOCOM next month presenting a little bit on this stuff and some of our more recent work. But some of these examples of emerging issues that might become really important and that are relevant, I think, for the conversation that we're having about peer and near-peer competitors. One of the examples is what we call smart feral cities. And this is a further refinement of doing emerging issues analysis, what my company calls disruptive combinations, where you take two different emerging issues and you intersect them to see the kinds of disruptive outcomes that other people could produce with them. And so smart feral cities is a combination of feral cities, which we've talked about in the literature for many years now, and smart cities, a more recent thing, looking at how we deploy technology in cities to manage metabolism and improve governance and things like that. And so basically you're looking at this issue of urban areas that are ungoverned by state actors and yet potentially suffused with smart city technology, and asking the question, what kinds of capabilities does that give to local non-state actors who now have incredible ISR within the urban space and increasingly are able to have that urban space become adaptive because of this emerging smart city technology. So smart feral cities. Another example of a disruptive combination would be crowdsourced distributed conflict. And this is the intersection of things like microtasking, crowdsourcing, distributed computing, collaborative platforms, crowdfunding, all of which can be used as a concept to quickly spin up and staff conflict and spin it down, right? So you have this issue, this idea of crowdsourced distributed conflict. You've got another one that we termed nation sourcing. And this was the intersection of things like digital fabrication, which a lot of people know better as additive manufacturing or 3D printing, with these movements that we've had in different countries in recent years around teaching all of our children to code. And so nation sourcing was this emerging issue around looking at how different countries, different areas could potentially turn every household, every community into a digital fabrication factory, into a cyber node, basically turning the whole entire population into a workforce for conflict, so nation sourcing. And the last one, moving a little bit further out, would be artificial intelligence. And you're looking at AI, irregular, and mercenary forces. And of course, we see a lot of interesting things now using artificial intelligence of different types, trying to get AI and machines into activities, but really looking a little bit farther ahead and really starting to ask the question, how will other actors be able to develop and deploy AI and networks of machines essentially as irregular forces, and then others using them as mercenary forces? And certainly, you know, in this century, we've talked a lot about privatization of security, and we've looked at private security contractors, and there's been lots of hand-wringing and lots of writing about that stuff. But it's entirely possible that as we move forward and deeper into the 21st century, really the mercenary forces, the new sort of mercenary companies will in fact be machines in various guises and various networks of that stuff. And so when we're looking at some of these emerging issues, some of our questions when it comes to innovation and experimentation are, on the one hand, what are we doing to innovate in terms of anticipating or in advance of these types of emerging issues? What are we doing to either forestall or take advantage of these things? And on the other side of the question, we're looking at how will some of these other actors and competitors out there take advantage of these things? We've got a small group of near-peer competitors who are getting very experienced running gray zone operations. So the question of how will they take advantage of these types of concepts and developments to further push that gray zone envelope and push those nice bright lines that we like further and further apart. And then one of the places that we're of course worried about when we look forward in the future is all of our non-state actors. And we expect that those non-state actors will become more plentiful, more myriad, and more diverse in their shape and form. And so of course we're asking, how will they develop these kinds of concepts, and what other kinds of more disruptive combinations of all of these different emerging issues might they bring together and pose the kind of challenges that we might not be ready for. And so that's the kind of stuff that we think about all the time.
Okay, good morning. Again, my name is Major General Cedric Wins, and it is a pleasure to be here. Really enjoy the opportunity to be here to speak with you a little bit today. Just want to talk a little bit about, number one, the ideas of innovation and how the command that I now have the privilege to lead, RDECOM, plays a role in that. And if you're in the United States Army, perhaps like I was, you may not know the power that exists within the United States Army to produce technology or to partner with industry in the development of technology that goes in the hands of warfighters. And this capability, which has existed for a number of years, has been critically important with providing technology that has allowed the warfighters to go out and do the things that they do, and in many cases to save lives. The command is a fairly young command relative to the 7 research, development, and engineering centers that exist under RDECOM. However, the proven delivery of technology, either directly from a research, development, engineering center or in partnership with industry, has occurred over a number of years. So many of you are aware of the counter-IED capability that was used both in Iraq and Afghanistan. Much of that technology was developed through RDECOM. A lot of the stuff that we were doing was really focused on delivering capability to the warfighter, principally focused on those fights. There's about 14,000 personnel in the command, 10,000 of which are engineers and scientists. And each and every day I've had the privilege to go and see some of the many things that they're doing in support of the warfighter. What we have done here over the last 10 months that I've been in command is we've set ourselves on a path to operationalize our RDECOM. And what I mean by that is putting the command and those scientists and engineers who are doing work for the Army, putting their focus centrally placed on what technology they can provide to the warfighter that will empower, protect, and enable their abilities to go and fight and win. The command is only a part of the S&T enterprise, which includes a much broader landscape than just RDECOM, and certainly within the Army there are other research and development engineering centers that get after medical technology and that get after engineering technology and that get after technology that helps to understand cognitive and physical demands on soldiers, but we represent a large part of what that is. And so oftentimes the partnerships that we establish internal to the Department of Defense with Dr. Roper's folks and the folks that are part of the Rapid Equipping Force and the folks that are part of Mr. Wiltsey's folks here up in the RCO, a lot of times they turn to us and we'd like them to turn to us first to find some of the technology that we're doing. The operational component of what we're doing in RDECOM is intended to ensure that our focus is on providing research, development, engineering, and science and technology for the warfighter to meet the priorities of the Chief of Staff of the Army. And so the Chief of Staff of the Army's priorities, number one, is readiness in the near term, and a lot of what we do in terms of providing engineering support gets right after that. So many challenges that have occurred within all of our warfighting functions across the full range of our equipment often requires engineering solutions, of which our life cycle management community within AMC will turn to RDECOM to get engineering support. The Chief's second priority is on the readiness of the future force. And that gets right at the heart of what we're doing in terms of developing science and technology and doing other research efforts to look to the Army of the future, look and help understand what concepts will be in play, how technology is moving across the next 20 to 30 years, and how those things can be incorporated into getting the technology for the future force. And so some of that technology goes towards the priorities that have been established by the Chief for science and technology to include robotics. And so we are working on many efforts along with other stakeholders that are a part of not only the Army, but the Department of Defense and to a certain extent broader other governmental agencies who are interested in maturing the technology. Our military application will be in many ways different than what other agencies may perhaps use, but there's still an ability for us to harness the collective efforts that go on in order to develop that technology. Likewise, with our engineering, with our international partners, both in international academic institutions as well as industry, international industry partners, we have an ability to go and collaborate. One of the key things that we are promoting within RDECOM that helps get at innovation is continuous collaboration with industry and early collaboration with industry. We do that through a number of ways, one of which that we're really pushing at the current time is an open campus arrangement with our Army Research Lab. Our Army Research Lab is responsible for providing the basic and foundational research that occurs within the Army, from anything, everywhere from energetics to robotics to increased armament for protection, a full range of things. And this open campus arrangement allows industry partners to come into the ARL space located in Adelphi, Maryland, and up at Aberdeen Proving Ground, and work in partnership to collaborate on ideas so that as we mature technology, we can gain the benefits of that technology, but it could also have a useful application for industry or whoever decides to partner with us. Another point about operationalizing the command is the international global reach that the command has. And so, for example, here in the Pacific, we have a number of entities that are not only here in the Pacific in support of the combatant commander and the ASCC in the form of our RDECOM forward elements and our field assistance in science and technology teams, but we also have science advisors who are throughout the Pacific looking to establish and work with partnerships with our international partners and our international industry partners to develop technology that is of mutual benefit. One of the things that you all will hopefully see here in the upcoming exercises that will be taking place will be how we are leveraging the ability of additive manufacturing to lighten and increase the speed by which soldiers can deliver on solutions to warfighting problems and warfighting challenges. So there's a lot going on within RDECOM. We want to represent the face of technology development for the Army, and we want to be that extension by which the combatant commanders, the ASCCs, turn to leverage what we have to help bring about solutions. So thank you.
Well, aloha. It's kind of interesting for a guy from South Carolina to say that, but I've been saying it a lot the last few days. My name's Doug Wiltsey. I'm the director of the Rapid Capability Offices, and as Dr. Godum said earlier, it was stood up the 31st of August of 2016, so we're about 8 months into this organization. Really, it was established by the previous Secretary of the Army, Secretary Fanning, to try and get at those strategic gaps defined by the combatant commands that there is not a material solution that is available in the next 1 to 5 years. And so when you look at acquisition in the Army, you have the ability to do things very, very quickly. Usually the Rapid Equipping Force is the organization that'll do that. They're an organization that works in the 0 to 1 year time period, sometimes 2 year time period. The institutional programs, the big enduring programs, they're going to take a much longer period of time. If you ask the chiefs, they take forever. They don't, but they do take a long time. And so the area that the Secretary wanted to have an organization focus on is this 1 to 5 year period, and that's where we're focused. In order to do that, there's a few things that are different in the way that we operate than in most acquisition organizations. The first is our chain of command is very short. There's a board of directors for the Rapid Capabilities Office. It is the Secretary of the Army, Chief of Staff of the Army, and the Army Acquisition Executive. Those are the 3 members. There are others that come to the meetings, but those are the 3 voting members. They will really be the area that assigns what work we do. We are very focused right now in areas that are dealing with Europe, but can be focused also in the Pacific. So things like electronic warfare, position, navigation, and timing, and the ability to deny GPS, cyber, both offensive and defensive cyber effects, as well as survivability are 4 areas that were initially assigned to us. The focus, though, is about a strategic gap, and so Dr. Roper had talked about teaming systems together, and one of the things that you'll find in our organization is that there's never really a single solution in one system that will answer the problem that we're trying to address. It is a combination of systems of systems. Within the organization, it's very multifunctional, and what I mean by that is that it's not a bunch of acquisition folks sitting out at a building at Fort Belvoir, but it is a combination of folks from within the combatant commands. We have elements of the USAR command that we're supporting today in efforts that we're doing. FORSCOM is involved, TRADOC is involved, ATEC is involved, so the Army Test and Evaluation Command is involved, members of the DA staff, to ensure that the information is flowing back and forth as to what the need is, what the focus is, and how we're trying to get at it. When a solution is developed, it has to be developed not just from a material standpoint, but also from an effect on force structure, an effect on training, an effect on sustainment. We can probably develop something that will meet the need, but if it takes 4 times as many specific soldiers to do that mission, it's not something that is palatable in the long term. And so the ability for us to have a multifunctional team that allows us to understand the entire effect of trying to bring an operational capability to the field, absolutely critical. Not just for the combatant commander, but also for the senior leaders to understand how they have to divert resources in order to be able to support it, if this is the solution. The way that the office works is that we focus on doing an analysis of a problem, coming up with an alternative set of solutions, bring that back to the board. The board will give us the decision on the direction they want us to go. We'll do an operation, we'll do some rapid prototyping at the system level, bring that back into an operational assessment, typically with a unit that's going to receive the equipment. There's an operational assessment done. This is capabilities and limitation. The equipment can do this, it can't do this, it is safe, but it's not an operational test that's measuring effectiveness, suitability, and survivability. It's not a check the block, or it's not a pass-fail. This is the capability. Do you still want it? In some cases, the answer will be no. One of the things we thrive on is the ability to fail. We just want to fail fast. We want to get it in there and understand what's wrong with it so that we can make the next turn and make it a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better. It will be incremental as it goes because of the fact that there is a need now. We will get a capability in there, and so long as the combatant commander agrees this reduces his operational risk and he can fight it, that's where we'll start with the promise that we will come back and bring a lot of the things you heard here: more automation, more machine learning. How do we reduce the workload on soldiers, but get a capability to start? The other thing that we utilize are folks that know how to do this. So you heard General Wynn talk about our RDE-COM. There is a treasure trove of knowledge in those organizations that allow us to tap into that organization and not have to learn this all over again. It is not our intent to build a separate organization off to the side. We have to leverage everything within the Army to be able to do this fast. We just have to be able to pull a team together and be able to execute. With that, the last thing that I'll tell you is, as a small organization just starting, one of the big things for us is collaboration. We want to collaborate with everyone, DIUX, with Mr. Taylor here, with Dr. Roper at the Strategic Capabilities Office, with DARPA, and a lot of efforts that they have going down there, with SOCOM, and anyone else that has a capability. We're not interested in trying to develop systems. What we're interested in doing is taking technologies that's available today and integrating it into an operational capability we can field. And so that's what we're trying to do. So look forward to your questions.
Aloha. I'm Isaac Taylor. I'm one of the civilian partners at the Defense Innovation Unit in Silicon Valley. This is a military unit located hierarchically within OSD, but physically the bulk of our manning plan is in Silicon Valley, in Mountain View, California. We also have offices in Boston, in Austin, Texas, and in DC. Approximately 50 full-time active duty military, with another 50 passionate reservists who work part-time with us around the country. As was mentioned earlier, in a past life, I worked for more than a decade at Google, and there had the privilege of working with many of the leading engineers and programmers, technologists and futurists of our time. I am not a PhD or an engineer, but I have learned by osmosis, if nothing else, how advanced technology development works well and how it doesn't. Not every project or program we worked on at Google was successful. But the ones that were successful have scaled to almost unimaginable importance. Something like Google Maps or the Google search engine or the Android phones, which only a decade ago, none of these words existed. These weren't projects, they weren't teams, they weren't things. That was less than a decade ago. Around that same time, DARPA made a really prudent, prescient investment in self-driving cars, in autonomous ground vehicles. And many of the successful participants, the winners of the DARPA Grand Challenge, went on to relocate to Silicon Valley and continue their life's work in the private sector rather than within the defense industry. And I'd like to look at that example through a more sort of systemic lens. Could we bring up the slide that shows R&D trends? Okay. So this slide shows, I'd like to talk about this in three ways, a sort of past, present, and future look at the same data. This data shows that the sum of private sector research and development funding now significantly exceeds the sum of all government research funding. And this was not always true. This has happened, as you can see, on our watch. You have to look back into the left tail of this slide to see the Cold War. And even during the height of the Cold War, there was rough parity between the sum of government spending on research and development and the sum of private sector spending. That is no longer true. In fact, the data shows that that hasn't been true for our professional lifetime. And so many of the systems that we built in the past to do science and technology research, research and development, to test, evaluate, operationalize, and deploy systems, frankly, these processes, these policies, these ways of working are not adapting as quickly as they could to match the current reality that we find ourselves in. And we need only look at CENTCOM, where we're seeing commercial off-the-shelf quadcopters being used to deliver lethal, accurate fires every day. That was predictable, and there are many other, let's say, weaponized variants of commercial off-the-shelf technology which are equally predictably dangerous. And I think it's worth, given we're here in PACOM, to think specifically about the implications for mass, the inherent tension between quantity and quality of effects. That equation is no longer quite as simple as it used to be to calculate, to analyze, to plan against. Because things like PNT or artificial intelligence or global remote control are no longer the exclusive domain of the defense industry or even of governments, but are now for sale to anyone. And for sale at really extraordinary quantities. If you think about the cell phone in your pocket, there are roughly on the order of 10 million new cell phones being manufactured every day. The overwhelming majority of which are right here in PACOM. But each of these phones contains all of the components that would be necessary to build a very dangerous, fully autonomous quadcopter. The miniaturized processor, memory, sensors, radios, the onboard storage of data, are rolling off assembly lines at unit volumes that normally only the defense industry would think at, but are now commoditized. They have not yet been weaponized, but I think we should assume they will. And the question then becomes, what are we going to do about it, and how are we going to work going forward? So if looking at the past and the present aspects of this R&D chart, as we look to the future, notice the increasing separation between the yellow line and the blue line on this chart. I'm not going to speak to why U.S. federal R&D is stable or perhaps even declining. That's over my pay grade, but speaks ultimately to things like the economic health of the society and our sort of net tax revenues. On the other hand, this yellow line, this is what I do for a living. And the reason that yellow line is increasing is because it's indexed to global population. The businesses that are leading the way now on research and development investment, in general, are consumer businesses. And in general, their revenues, and from that their profits, and from that their R&D investments, are indexed to a logarithm. They're doubling as the population grows. The current global product, the GWP, the sum of all GDPs, is approximately $25 trillion a year. And if the net profit margins from that are even only 1%, this is a very, very large sum. So we can anticipate this separation will continue and accelerate. And this is both a professional challenge. This is one of the primary dynamics motivating some of the proliferating threats we face today. It's also the opportunity of a lifetime. From a solution finding perspective, there is a really rare opportunity as Army RCO looks at this, not to reinvent, redevelop unique solutions, but actually to go find things that already work wonderfully. They can be cheaper, faster, and better than new work we would do on our own. And we need only look at robotics, autonomy, AI, commercial space to see this trend in action. The town I live in, Mountain View, I have two small children that have lived there their whole life, and every day of their life, robot cars have driven past our house. Every day of their life, robot cars have driven past their school. My children take this for granted. My daughter remembers when I was working on these programs. She thinks this is the new normal. And we will in the future go to war with the Army that we build and bequeath, right, to our children. They will inherit from us what they will use when they're sitting here in PACOM or around the world. And I think we're tremendously lucky that Silicon Valley, as a great nexus of private sector innovation, is located within the United States and within the Western system. The burden is now on us to find a way to work together scalably, flexibly, with the real private sector to bring its best technology to bear on our most pressing military national security challenges. That's how we look at things at DIUX. And I look forward to working with everyone in the Army to continue the work we've begun. We have, to date, seen the Army plussing up our DIUX internal R&D investments. For every dollar we spend, there are multiple dollars coming from our military customers. Maybe more importantly, there are 10 to 1,000x private sector investment dollars following these lead investments we're making. More specifically, DIUX has deployed approximately $60 million to date over the last year. And the companies we've invested in have received $1.6 billion of private sector venture capital investment. So there's a leverage story there, an economy story that I think speaks to the future of how we look at research and development and warfighting here in PACOM and around the world. Thanks.
So I'd like to thank thank all the panelists for their opening remarks. As you can see, there's quite a diversity of experience, but certainly a focus on innovation in the panel today. I'm going to be moderating questions, and even when questions are directed at one individual of the panel, I would invite all of the members to comment if you feel like you have something to add. And I think it's only fair that I have to start so that we get the ball rolling. So a question addressed to me is, how has the moral dimension of artificial intelligence, fully and partially autonomous systems, and robotization kept pace with technological advancements, particularly as decisions are made in milliseconds, quicker than human operators can be aware? It's a great question because in the West, we are going to have a high burden of ethical standard to use systems that are autonomous and partially autonomous. And you may know that it's our department's policy that we don't delegate lethal decisions to autonomous systems, that humans maintain them. But that's just a first step in trying to figure out, what does having humans in control mean? And what I'm confident it's not going to be able to mean, if we want to have the advantage that autonomy will give us, is it will not mean knowing absolutely in a deterministic way what autonomous systems or groups of autonomous systems will do. I think it's going to have to change more into knowing what they won't do. I'll give you an example of this. When we did the large swarm of micro UAVs in 60 minutes, I have no idea where any individual UAV is going to go. But I do understand what their group dynamic is going to be. I understand that they're going to form up into a formation, that they're going to go and conduct surveillance. I'm able to draw geofences around the area and kill UAVs if they leave that area, so that I can say UAVs are not going to areas that I don't want them to be. I think that's going to be a trend that we're going to see more and more, is that we're going to define the effects we don't want autonomous systems to take, and then the burden will be us on designers to be able to prove to department leadership and to the world that there's no way around those loopholes. I think the first place that we will be challenged for this, as you can all anticipate, is going to be in the cyber domain, where increasingly attacks are moving quickly. All of the technology that's needed, as Isaac was mentioning in his talk, is available for us in the commercial sector to push cyber down to a range where people simply cannot be involved. And in the US, we're not going to be able to go into that wild, wild west without having some ideas about how people are in control. So in my mind, I could imagine something like a cyber immune system that's acting down at a cellular level much faster than people can know what individual white blood cells are going to do. But up at a macro level, where a doctor would interact with our immune system, there are still the analogs of temperature and blood pressure, so that you can diagnose how things are going and change courses of action if you're not pleased with the results. All of that is to say that we're going to have to get this idea of ethics driven down to an engineering level, so that when we tell leadership that we're in control, we can explain at a very precise, technical, detailed level what that means. I will accept that that is a good answer, unless, George, you wanted to comment?
Well, I'll give it a shot. So I guess the question has to do with how does the moral or the ethical dimensions keep pace with the advance in technological developments, and using artificial intelligence as an example. About 2 summers ago, there was a Defense Science Board on autonomy, and I was able to present findings to the DSB, but I was not a part of the DSB per se. And they spoke at length about this very question. And generally speaking, and if you look historically at how this has manifested itself, this being the moral dimension with technological developments, generally speaking, the moral or the ethical considerations tend to lag behind the speed at which things change technologically. And I think that we're going to continue to see that. That's not for lack of effort in trying to stay abreast with those technological developments. So in the area of artificial intelligence, as well as in autonomy, or the use of AI in autonomy, part of the discussion had to do with, if your system is designed to directly take another human's life, for example, then it would be appropriate to have a human in the loop making that decision as opposed to the machine. So we have those discussions. We try to keep a pace or abreast with the changing technological landscape, but it's tough to do because our morals and our ethics tend to lag behind our technology.
Anyone else on the panel?
The only thing I would say is that it's a conversation that needs to occur at all levels. We went through, so I spent most of my life working acquisition for the intelligence community, and over the last 16 years, we came to realize very quickly that technology allowed us to do things that policy and law didn't allow us to do. But an operator may not know where he was. This is at a much higher level. This is a much more serious conversation, but it's a conversation that needs to occur from senior leadership all the way down in the formation as to how we're going to do this, and that conversation needs to continue. It's not a one-time conversation because technology is going to continue to push, and we need to understand how we want to fight this capability and what is okay and what's not okay, and it's a conversation that just has to continue.
All right, great. Well, let's move on to the next question. This is addressed to the entire panel, so I'll throw it out and see who wants to volunteer to jump in first. So the question is, what kinds of policy, legal, or regulatory change need to be changed or adjusted to strengthen the relationship between industry, partners, and military departments, agencies, and commands? Which red tape has to go, folks?
I'll take this one. The one thing I'd like to address actually is a meme, a theme that has crept actually into this week, but more generally in my travels over the last year through the department. It's easy to find people who will throw the acquisitions team under the bus. It's much harder to find people who speak up on behalf of all of our colleagues who have invested, the best years of their lives in acquisitions. One of the things that I've learned is that we frankly already have all the authorities we need to do things differently and do things better. The commercial solutions opening, which is a flavor of other transaction authority that we utilize intensively at DIUX, is available to everyone in the Army, everyone in the department. It's just not commonly used to do advanced technology development, let alone major systems development. Let me also address a misunderstanding that has frequented some of the press coverage about DIUX, which is that we only work with non-traditional, non-defense contractors. That's not true at all. In fact, many of our most successful projects are consortiums involving traditional defense contractors and startups or non-traditional companies. And I think that's actually the future here, is that we need to go find interesting technology in new places and figure out how to integrate it, test it, evaluate it, and then transition it to the warfighter, not in a vacuum and not independent of our existing doctrine, our existing playbook, as Will called it earlier, but together in new ways. It's that sort of combined arms approach, utilizing authorities we already have that will allow us to be quick. Conversely, if we spend the next 5 years lobbying for change in DC and then the subsequent 5 years trying to install that new playbook, well, it's 10 years will pass very, very quickly. So I would encourage everyone to be extremely creative at looking at the full flexibility of the authorities we already have.
So I'll add to that. I agree with everything that Isaac said. I think that this is one of those, it depends. If you're trying to create the next main battle tank, this is going to go through a very methodical process so that we understand exactly the threat and how it's evolving, the requirements, and it's going to go through a process that will take a long time. What I think you see with a lot of the folks up here is we're either trying to fill that gap that says there's a gap today, we need to fill it. We don't know what the requirement is going to be. We have an idea of what the capability is, but the specific requirements we don't know, and I agree with Isaac, there are contracting tools that allow us to get at those kinds of things quickly, these other transaction authorities, these OTAs. There is the ability for us to move very quickly so long as we focus in one area. So for one of the key tenets for my organization is we will never field the entire United States Army. We will field to a combatant command that solution that needs to close the gap. That allows us within the law to do the things that we can do. But there's a desire, and the chief has a report that I don't believe has been submitted, but it may have been submitted in answer to the NDAA 16, where he's answering that question. What kind of changes does he need for acquisition reform to be able to do that? And so clearly I want to save my job, and I'm not going to get out ahead of the chief on anything, but there has been a team that has looked at that. But again, it depends. I have heard him say many times, he wants to get development systems in the hands of users quickly so we can get feedback on how that system will operate and how they will develop their TTPs and CONOPS in conjunction with what the equipment is. And so there are efforts to do that, but I agree with Isaac. We have a lot of the capability today, but it doesn't scale to the entire institutional army to go very quickly unless we're in a war.
So if I could just make a comment about this from a S&T perspective, as I understand it. So I agree with the comments about the necessity of policy changes, because within the S&T side of the house, what often gets discussed are the things that need to be resolved with respect to intellectual property. And a lot of times we look at it from two different lenses. So my view of the conversation about intellectual property from the standpoint of the Army's research and development arm is that it does us little to no good to come up with the development of a technology and not be willing, under the right and the appropriate legal arrangements, to pass it over to either an industry partner or to transition it into an acquisition program, because we will never get the value of that technology. And so it's important for us to figure out how to do that. One of the ways that I believe that we should be trying to leverage more is, again, that early collaboration. A second way is in the use and leveraging the ability that we have to do experimental prototyping. So often there's this conversation about prototyping and the value of prototyping to the Army, and whether or not Army S&T ought to be involved in prototyping. And I say the answer to that question is yes, particularly in the area of experimental prototyping. The developmental prototyping and the pre-production prototyping, we have to leave that to our industry partners to do, because at that point in time, I think we are largely in the space of a developmental program where there's competition, there's downscoping going on. But in the area of experimental prototyping, where we are either trying to demonstrate something to inform a concept, or we are trying to learn all that we can from a user perspective in order to buy down risk, I think that is an opportunity for us to not only work within the Army amongst all of the S&T enterprise, but also with our ability to work with certain industry partners who value that opportunity and believe that they can derive some benefit and also make a contribution to a gap that the Army is particularly interested in closing. The one area I think when I see people always holding up the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, and showing you how thick it is and how much it has in it. The one point that I would make about that, if there's anything in there that can't be bypassed or modified with OTAs and the like, then we ought to think about those things being appropriate for change, because in this day and age, the way technology is going, the speed of delivery is the most important thing that we're trying to get at based on warfighter needs.
All right, great. And since we're on this topic of what needs to change, I'm going to ask a related question that's addressed to me and to Doug, but of course it's open to the entire panel. So the question reads, Dr. Roper said, quote, "We have to adapt at the pace of industry," end quote. How will the DoD, specifically ASALT and the Program Executive Office, keep pace within programs of record for Army innovation? And the question ends with an insight: currently technology laps our programs of record. So I'll start this off, and then I'm very interested to hear what Doug wants to add, since he is in the Army. But there are a couple of things that we can do, and I think Isaac's point's well taken, that it is often trendy to talk about the acquisition process as horrible or broken, but you have to remember that it won the Cold War for us. So it was a valuable thing of its time, but it is of a previous time. In the Cold War, we did not live in an era where technology that's changing the world was changing itself at a pace that's yearly or every other yearly. So its pace is simply what doesn't work anymore. Okay, so when you look at what 5000 does, is it takes a very high-level objective, like winning a war, and it breaks it down into, well, what does that mean in terms of land power, naval power, air power? And it continually breaks it down until eventually you get to numbers on paper that describe increasingly complicated engineering details of systems. And the complication is another factor, is that the systems we build today are more complicated than systems we built in the past. So it's becoming harder and harder for this decomposition of a high-level objective into thousands of pages of numbers that are written down that describe performance to be right. So if you think about it the other way, if we have 1,000 pages of numbers that describe a system we want to buy, how do we know before we've even started bending metal what's easy and what's hard? You know, any one of those numbers ends up being harder than we think, then we have to stay after it until that requirement is met. And so one of the things that we've been really pushing in SCO is write your requirements in pencil. And yes, 5000 does allow you to do that. So that when a number becomes too hard, revisit. Take the performance back up to the mission level and determine, are you spending too much time and effort trying to put one extra degree of gold plating onto something that is good enough for rock and roll today? So that's one thing that would be huge and impactful across the Defense Department. A second thing, and this is going to be a challenge, is we've got to learn to make open architectures profitable for industry. We always want them, but if you're an industry proposing to build a system and we say we want an open architecture, then what you know is that you will build that system and then we will continually recompete the components and your profit margins go down. Well, if we don't find a way to make that profitable for you so that we can continually recompete the components, then we're not going to be able to spiral system subcomponents at their natural pace. There's no reason that we shouldn't be building systems where the software works more like apps, but the reason we can't do it is we can't make building the OS profitable. And I can imagine ways of doing it, but that's something that needs to be thought about at the department level. And if we did, I think we'd spiral faster, we'd get better technology inject, and we'd award more contracts. And awarding more contracts would be better for industry, keeping the industry base sharp and not making these once-in-a-30-year awards an existential crisis for key companies that have worked for us for decades. Doug, you want to add?
I am. I agree with everything you just said, and so from a mechanic standpoint, what I would tell you is I think that the biggest thing is there's 3 or 4 parts to this, but the first is before you decide what you're going to buy, General Ostrovsky, who's the new military deputy to the Army Acquisition Executive, has a phrase that says, we got to stay left of B. So for those of you guys who don't understand acquisition speak, which is okay, we go through 2 different development cycles, then we go into production. All right, we do technology maturation, prototyping, and then we go into engineering and manufacturing development, which leads to a system, goes into a test, that goes into production, and we go. So the milestone that gets you into this engineering, manufacturing, development, which locks down the requirements. Everything is now tightly defined. You are being measured and graded against your ability to meet this massive document, is this milestone B, which gets you into engineering and manufacturing development. The idea is stay left of it. Let's bring in, for a little bit of money, let's bring in partners to do prototyping, run operational assessments, get an idea of what the capability is, buy down the risk, because today the big programs spend a lot of time in this development phase where we're actually developing technology at the same time as trying to build a tank or a helicopter or whatever it is. And so stay left of B. Have a very short manufacturing development go into production. Make it incremental. So this conversation about open architecture, absolutely true. Modular open system architectures is going to be absolutely critical, which means big companies who are very vertical will not be selling everything to this device over the next 10 years. It is a change in the business model, and there has to be an adaptation to that change in the business model. But make it incremental. The third piece of this is measure technology based on the operational capability that it brings. We need to take a step back. It's not that every widget is a good thing. It's the operational capability that every widget brings. So how do we bring the systems of systems together to be able to project some kind of a capability? And technology may not be inserted in this device, but it may be inserted in something else. But what we've got to be able to do is understand from an operational architecture and from how we model this will be used, because the threat changes. So how do you build the warfighting models that allow you to understand, if you insert this capability here, we can stay with technology. It may not go in the systems we have. It may be adaptive to the systems we have, or we may decide that it provides such a significant change in capability, we have to stop and incrementally put it into this piece. So those are my ideas.
All right, I think we're down to final minutes of the panel, so I'm going to take a little bit of moderator privilege and ask my own question. I'd like to start down with Isaac and work our way down the table, and I'd like to see if we can each give this answer in about 15 seconds, because we have to end on a positive note. So what makes you most optimistic? What makes you most excited? What is it that gives you hope about the future?
So I'm going to answer that question through the lens of the earlier fiendish question about ethics and drones. What makes me excited and happy is that it's us asking and answering these questions. If we continue to lead the way on the development and operationalization of technologies, they will be ethical because we are.
Doug?
I would say that the thing that gives me the most hope on this is that we've started. So the starting of my organization is not to have just an entity off to the side that does really cool stuff. We've got to be able to integrate this into the acquisition community, and we have to allow it to evolve. And doing that is going to allow us to be faster across the board, and understanding that what Isaac has shown, the golden jewels are out in industry in maybe areas that we don't know, and we just need to figure out how to get them in to add to the capability we have.
So I think my optimism comes from the organization that I'm a part of. Just watching the fabulous work and the great insights and intellect that exists within RDECOM and the broader S&T enterprise. I think the recognition, many of the comments made here speak to that, of our understanding of where the Department of Defense, from an S&T perspective, should play versus where our industry partners play, given the increased investment that the chart depicts that industry is now making in research and development. Is another thing that if we recognize the The Army's ability to bring about successful technology is to leverage and partner and collaborate with industry, but also to not get mired down in trying to do things that compete in the same space. And so I think we recognize that, and I think we see the opportunity going forward.
I think our history's shown that, you know, when we get pushed and when the environment changes, maybe sometimes we're slow off the mark, but we dig in and we adapt. And we've done that successfully many times in our history. And frankly, when it comes to competing on the world stage, we may not have the most populous country in the world with 330 million, but we're pretty well educated, we're pretty interconnected, we're pretty open. And if you can connect that and unleash that, that's a whole lot of adaptive potential. And I really think that if we're able to tap that, we can do a whole lot of incredible things.
I think that what makes me the most optimistic is that every day I have the opportunity to work with or meet some of the smartest, most talented, most professional, most patriotic Americans I have ever met. And thank God you're on our side.
I think mine is very similar to George's, is that, you know, we're saying we're going to change everything about how we're going to warfight, and that we're going to become unpredictable. We're going to regain the element of surprise, and that's very heavily focused on technology. But the true strategic capability that underwrites it is the incredible proficiency of our operators, especially our soldiers. Not every military in the world can just come in and say, hey, let's just change it all up, and expect that their people will adapt as quickly as ours can. So really, even though we're talking tech and innovation, it's really the human factor that gives us the greatest advantage. All right. Well, the time went quickly, but I would like to, open up by asking everyone to give our panel a round of applause. Secondly, I'd like to thank General Brown and all the folks that have helped work to make this possible. I'd like to thank AUSA for this very important forum, and hopefully we keep getting together year after year until the Army becomes the most lethal fighting force that's ever been on the ground. Thank you very much.